Welcome to our webinar again today, and thank you so much again for joining us this morning. And I am Samdi, I'm the head of program at the Center for Khmer Study, talking from Cambodia. So before starting, I would like to invite all of you to introduce yourself in our chat box as well, like your name, where you're joining us from, and your institute, or also the university. So our webinar is live on Zoom and also on Facebook, and the video or the discussion is recorded as well. And I'm pleased today that we have our speaker, Dr. Celia Touchman-Rasta, and also our moderator, Dr. Stephanie Curry, joining us today. So before getting started, I'm very pleased to invite both of you to introduce yourselves to our attendee as well, and starting from Dr. Celia Touchman-Rasta, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm so looking forward to this presentation, presenting for you today some of the research and things that I've been working on in the past year. As Samadi said, my name is Celia Tuckman-Rasta, and I am a senior research fellow at the Center for Khmer Studies and also an adjunct assistant professor in the history, philosophy, and anthropology department at CUNY York College. I completed my PhD in cultural anthropology a few years ago at the University of California, Riverside. And my research overall looks at tourism, the impacts of tourism, national policy, and discourses of intangible heritage on the creative and economic development of classical Cambodian dance. My research has been supported by the Center for Khmer Studies and the Fulbright program. And my current project with CKS is on the corporeal economy, or the bodily labor that goes into preparation and performance, focusing on the individual experiences of dancers trained in the traditional arts. Some of my work has been published in Economic Anthropology and the Asian Theater Journal, and I'm really excited to actually be working on a project right now with the moderator, Dr. Stephanie Curry, about Cambodia's intangible heritage. So Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Curry, and I'm currently a lecturer in ethnomusicology in the music department at Tufts University in the United States. And so most of my work has been conducted in Cambodia on the lakhon khol theater, and notably the rural tradition attached to the Wat Van diet. And I am also currently working on the role of 1960s and 1970s pop and rock music in memory and knowledge transmission among the Cambodian American community here in the US. So as Celia said, we are currently working on a project together, and so that's why I'm particularly excited to be moderating the session for her.
Thank you so much, and I think that all of us are really looking forward to see the presentation and learn more from the webinar as well. So I'm pleased to let you know that Center for Khmer Study, we promote research, teaching, and public services in social sciences, art, and humanity in Cambodia and the Mekong region. So the webinar today will be about innovation within heritage, the connection between Cambodian dance preservation and the development. The webinar will take about the presentation will take up to 40 minutes. However, it will be held different section of the presentation. So during the presentation, I would like to encourage you that if you have any question, please leave your question in the Q&A box for those who join it on Zoom. Or you can use the raise hand function, and our moderator, Dr. Stephanie Curry, will call on your name and we will turn on your microphone. But for those who joining on our Facebook Live, so if you have any questions, you still can leave your question in the comment, and we will make sure to bring all those comments to our speaker to address as well. So before further ado, I'm pleased to invite Dr. Celia Tuckman-Rasta to do the presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Before I get started, let me just share the screen, make sure that's all working. Okay, and I just want to make sure, can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see my PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank CKS for organizing this webinar and for supporting not only my own work, but the work of so many local and international scholars with an interest in Cambodian history, culture, and society. During my first trip to Cambodia in 2008, I visited the library at Wat Dam Nak on my second day in the country and met with the director at the time, Philippe Cam, who generously guided a stray graduate student with no Khmer language skills. And ever since that time, CKS has been an invaluable resource for my research projects. And of course, special thanks to Samadi and the rest of CKS staff for their time and effort in putting this event together, and to Stephanie for accepting my invitation to serve as a moderator on the panel. As you can see, I will be presenting about innovation within heritage, the connections between Cambodian dance, preservation, and development. Today's webinar is based on a parallel line of inquiry to my larger research project that drew my attention in the fall of 2019. It's less about individual experiences of the body and more about the broader context in which heritage serves to inspire artistic innovation within Cambodian dance. For the sake of clarity throughout the presentation, I'm using the term classical dance or robamboran to refer to that performing art genre or tradition that is deeply rooted in the all-female court dance genre, although I recognize that this is an imprecise term and that the genre has had many names throughout history. In an epilogue by the anthropologist Edward Bruner of the recent volume Creativity/Anthropology, he wrote, "If we believe that culture is a heavy, ponderous, and static, if it is a slowly changing beast, if there is nothing new under the sun, if culture is a burden, even oppressive, a weight to bear, then it takes a giant to move the world even a little. But if we see culture as always in production, as constituted and reconstituted in every act, if we see culture as alive, in constant movement, if we believe that cultural transmission is not a mechanical replication or reproduction of the heavy heritage of the past, then creative personas have a wide open field. She and he can do anything. If not move the world, then at the very least, they can move themselves and their culture." In November, it was November 1st, 2019, and I was with Nekru Noptida, a folk dancer who trained at the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh in the 1980s. About 15 minutes into our conversation, Tida said, "We appreciate that young people are interested in dance." Sorry, again. "We appreciate that young people are interested in dance development and want to include internationally inspired technique, but we're worried that in 10 to 20 years, when they are doing preservation, they will think that the newly developed style, as in the style of 2019, they will think that the newly developed style is Khmer. About developing, we can develop, yes, yung tua apirak chaon, but we need to develop in order to preserve. We need to develop in a form or style that preserves, like Nekru Sopalin." Here, Tida refers to an established choreographer who developed a neoclassical genre. Tida continued, "And I think as well, I can use Khmer gestures, but add new elements into them. For example, Kubak Boran Mien Sarlain Mien Yom Mien Avai Vainang Tiet." In classical dance gestures, we have love, crying, etc. But for example, and at this moment, Tida stood and said, "Love, the gesture for love." She showed the gesture for love, her arms crossed in front of her chest, hands gracefully curved and gently placed on opposite shoulders. Her right leg steps forward and her chest makes a brief serpentine movement. She explains that the movement can be pushed further. She repeats the hand gesture, this time adding a pivot where the right foot crosses in front of the left, her body leans to the right, and she turns towards the left. She shows the distinction again and says, "We develop within preservation." This topic of conversation emerged from a question that I posed about a phrase in a speech given by the Minister of Culture and Fine Arts at the closing ceremony of a singing competition a few days earlier, on October 26, 2019. She stated, "Boran manyut samai mun borate," which could be loosely translated to "ancient traditions are not backwards, this era isn't foreign." This expression first appeared in my field notes nearly 8 years earlier, on March 3, 2012, National Culture Day, in a speech by Sun Sovani, the director of the Department of Performing Arts of Siem Reap Province at the time. It highlights a strong desire to bolster a uniquely Khmer identity through artistic endeavors and a continued concern that because of globalization, Cambodia's younger generations may lose sight of what it is to be Khmer. Artists informed me that this saying had become a common slogan of the Ministry of Culture by 2019. And one dancer actually used the phrase during an interview when I hadn't even brought it up in conversation. In 2019, as in 2012, I also heard a parallel slogan, "Api wat Dumbai api rek," "Api rek Dumbai api wat," or "Api wat knong api rek." So to develop in order to preserve and preserve in order to develop. But in 2019, this development had become a stronger focus. The juxtaposition of the phrases inspired me to look more deeply into the tensions inherent in creative work that have been apparent in Cambodian dance discourses over the last decade, a desire to ensure that art forms, which are deeply rooted in cultural traditions, maintain their enduring elements and simultaneously maintain relevance to younger and future generations. This is in line with Ed Bruner's assertion that cultural transmission is not merely a reproduction of the heritage of the past, that within the limits of cultural constraints, there is space for innovation and creativity to flourish. The national discourse in Cambodia is reminiscent of discourses surrounding UNESCO's Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity, or ICH. Comenelli and Gruff point out that ICH is, quote, "not static. It continually transforms and innovates, nourishing creative processes," end quote. They examine how the preservation of heritage is transmitted generationally, adaptable to multiple needs, and used creatively in new ways. Classical dance, shadow puppet theater, spike tom, chapei dang veng, and recently the all-male mass dance drama lakhon have been recognized by UNESCO as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And I argue here that this recognition has helped shape the trajectory of arts development in Cambodia over the past 2 decades. A shift in discourse in Cambodia between 2011 and 2020 towards an increased focus on development and innovation within these artistic heritage traditions prompts the following questions. What does it mean to innovate inside of tradition? How do artists use tradition to inspire growth and creativity in the arts? To address these questions, first, I will provide a brief overview of the development of UNESCO's concept of ICH, the scholarly reaction to the convention, and the relationship between ICH and discourses of preservation and innovation. And then I will look at ICH and tensions between arts preservation and development within the specific framework of Cambodia, using specific examples from my research of how heritage inspires artistic creativity and growth. It's important to note that not all of the dance forms I mentioned in the presentation are inscribed on UNESCO's list of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity. However, discourses surrounding heritage and culture have influenced arts innovation across multiple genres. So I just want to remind everyone to, if you do have questions, so please ask those questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand, and I will, if you do have a question while I'm going through the presentation, I will try to take some time to pause and answer questions as we go along. So now I'm going to move on to the discussion of UNESCO Intangible Heritage Preservation and Development. So as Dennis Byrne points out, heritage only comes into being via the discourse of heritage. And to this extent, heritage, being by nature discursive, is always intangible. In UNESCO's attempt to preserve the cultural diversity of the world, it has developed 3 World Heritage initiatives: natural heritage, tangible cultural heritage, and most recently, intangible heritage. Natural heritage refers to outstanding features of the environment and animals that are in need of conservation on aesthetic or scientific grounds. Tangible heritage refers to monuments and buildings of historical or anthropological value. And intangible heritage was designed to encompass items of cultural value not protected by other conventions, proclamations, and pacts. So as discussed by Dennis Byrne, this shift from a focus on material, tangible culture to the intangible highlights the interplay between performance culture and its material counterparts. So the Convention for the Safeguarding of the Oral and Intangible Heritage of Humanity is which I will from now on just refer to as the Convention, is a complex process involving the work of many individuals with differing perspectives. Here, I will only be able to provide a general overview of these discourses with a focus on implications of intangible heritage policy for dance production in Cambodia. For more of the history of UNESCO's intangible heritage policy, and for the terminology used and criteria for eligibility, there are many good sources that cover all forms of heritage from that UNESCO perspective. Some examples are listed here, including the work of Rodney Harrison, Heritage Critical Approaches, Lynn Meskel's Global Heritage, a Reader, Laura Jane Smith's The Uses of Heritage, and Michael DeGiovanni's work on the heritage scape. Okay. So the intangible heritage, as defined by UNESCO, includes the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. In this definition, the Convention highlights the importance of oral traditions and language, the performing arts, craftsmanship, rituals, and general cultural knowledge. The Convention was, as I said, the culmination of decades of work, beginning after World War II, when there was increasing concern about how damage to cultural property due to war was affecting the world's culture, a concern that shifted towards the ephemeral or intangible in the 1970s, with a broadening awareness that, that focusing on monuments and movable objects was too narrow. Laura Jane Smith explains that the advent of ICH, or intangible cultural heritage, offers a potential challenge and correction to authorize what she calls authorized heritage discourses. Or AHD. So by drawing attention to the variety of ways that heritage can be expressed and drawing attention to heritage practices at a sub-national level. So in other words, community practices. She identifies AHD as a discourse that emerges from the 19th century debates in Western architecture and archaeological scholarship about the need to protect material culture that scholars deem to be of innate and inheritable value. In this framework, heritage is defined as material, non-renewable, and fragile, and it is entwined with discourses of nationhood, citizenship, and nationalism, a Eurocentric vision of heritage. Advocates for cultural heritage tried but failed to protect the intangible through legal concepts such as copyright and patents. With the realization that these works couldn't be traced to individuals, Unesco's focus moved to the importance of supporting people who held the knowledge of these forms, whether they were performers, artisans, or teachers. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett notes that performers are carriers, transmitters, and bearers of tradition, terms which connote a passive medium, a conduit, a vessel without volition, intention, or subjectivity. Intangible heritage refers to practices and skills embodied in people and as a living force. They are both transmitted and transformed between generations in response to changing social and physical contexts. Change is intrinsic to culture, and measures intended to preserve, conserve, and safeguard and sustain cultural practices are caught between freezing the practice and addressing the inherently processual nature of culture. Preservation and conservation are key ideas in intangible heritage, and the focus on ensuring the viability of these traditional arts has been called safeguarding. This involves making sure that cultural forms continue to be practiced today and that they will survive into the future to benefit the community. The need for safeguarding comes from the idea that intangible heritage is fragile and subject to disappearance without proper care and preservation. Some, however, argue that this is a tension between fixity and evanescence, or put another way, perhaps a confusion between impermanence and disappearance that emerges again out of Eurocentric understandings of heritage and development. Many feel that standardization stemming from globalization, tourism, conflict, and urbanization is threatening intangible heritage. These advocates thus urge safeguarding integral aspects of cultural identity as formulated by the UNESCO Convention. While they have good intentions, others argue that this fear stems from European romantic and modernist notions of heritage and cultural production. In the romantic view, cultures can only be understood by those who are part of that culture, and the identity of society is embodied by what is unchanged and incommensurable. The modernist view of cultural production privileges the originality of end products, ranking them on a scale of inferior imitations to superior innovations. While a broader view is likely intended by UNESCO, one like that of Brunner discussed earlier, in which copying and reproduction should not be placed in opposition to creativity, but as part of the creative process, in which there is an assumption that people will draw elements from the past as they improvise and experiment in emerging environments. Some argue that this underplays the extent to which reductive modernist understanding has become a template for cultural production abroad. As Brunner points out, quote, "Our Western metaphysics is the notion of a privileged original, a pure tradition which exists in some prior time, from which everything now is contemporary degradation. He argues that scholars have been challenging these romantic views of a pure tradition, and yet these ideas have been incorporated into nationalist discourses. Basically, they've traveled abroad, leading people in different places in the world to question their own authenticity. And he calls this the problem of authenticity, which would stem from that romantic perspective. So I'm now going to move on to discussing how dance in this intangible heritage in the context of Cambodia, and looking at later how innovation or how there's inspiration for new work through that heritage. But again, if anybody has any questions, there will be times throughout that discussion where I can pause and take some questions. So please do feel free to ask questions in that Q&A area. The global proliferation of romantic views of heritage with the modernist perspective discussed before had a major impact on perceptions of Cambodian intangible heritage, both inside of the and outside of the country, particularly given the country's recent history. In 2017, Catherine Grant wrote that challenges to traditional music genres can be traced to years of war and genocide. She argues that the tragic history of the Khmer Rouge means that the need to preserve and revitalize culture applies not only to ethnic minorities, but also to the majority indigenous Khmer people. And that master musicians and possibly the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts tend to be inclined towards safeguarding music traditions, locating authenticity in anything that was created prior to the Khmer Rouge era, a trend that is true for other performing arts as well. During the Khmer Rouge period, like other residents of Phnom Penh, artists were dispersed to the countryside and many were killed. Classical dancers were seen as a representation of royal power, so banning that particular art form was symbolic for the regime. And the attempt to create a new culture starting from year zero led to the ban of other performing arts traditions as well. Scholars and artists note that revival and innovation in the dance forms has occurred throughout history, yet at least in the early 2000s, Tim Winter points out that the changes to classical dance in the 1950s and 60s were unproblematically solidified as both authentic Angkorian dance and the definitive classical dance in Cambodia in a way that might be seen as inhibiting the cultivation of Cambodian performing arts. Catherine Grant also noted that the potential for repercussive conditions preventing the, quote, full freedom of artistic expression, end quote, along with other concerns about the threat of international influence, such as music from pop genres. This trend towards a vision of an authentically Khmer dance, reminiscent of the romantic view, can be seen in nationalistic phrases like Boran Munyut Samai Mun Borate. I first heard this phrase, as I said, at National Culture Day, an annual rallying point for creating a national identity. The theme of the 14th Annual National Day on March 3rd, 2012 was, quote, "Everything is for the sustainability of national culture." Fear of cultural loss underscored the celebration in Siem Reap province. The stated aims were to diffuse national culture and prevent the influx of foreign culture. Following a performance of the classical blessing dance, which you can see on the right, a long series of speeches extolled Cambodia's cultural traditions, food, attire, the temples, and the performing arts. Warnings were doled out about the dangers of listening to pop music, watching internet videos, and becoming too influenced by other cultures. In her speech, Sun Sovani, the director of the Department of Culture and Fine Arts in Siem Reap, repeated the phrase, ancient traditions are not backwards. This era isn't foreign. The Samaimun Yut, Boranmun Yut, Samaimun Borate, adding, today, let us think about our cultural identity. Today, this one day each year, how it has given birth to our government. In a twist, for National Culture Day in 2021, which was themed Youth for National Culture, the official message from Prime Minister Hun Sen highlighted the importance of using technology and social media to raise awareness of national arts and culture in view of the calamity of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2012, I discussed issues of cultural sustainability with ministry officials, teachers, and artists, and many shared the belief that it was more important for the future of the art form to conserve dance practices of the past than to promote its creativity and development. The Director General of Intangible Cultural Heritage at the time, Ok Sopon, said that the role of the General Department was to both preserve and develop Cambodian dance, but, quote, we lost our heritage, so preservation and conservation are our main duty. This was echoed in country reports from UNESCO meetings and ministry documents. A Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts publication from 2008, for example, went as far as stating, Khmer classical dance was inscribed on the list of masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity, so there should be no further development. The duty of the ministry, according to the document, is to preserve the dance form for the future. A few officials, such as Prong Chiang, the former rector of the Royal University of Fine Arts, did acknowledge that there is also room for evolution in the dance form. In 2012, he said, quote, some of the teachers think that the young dancers are using classical dance gestures incorrectly, but they are wrong. And he explained that classical dance gestures are the foundation of all performing arts, including Yige and Basak. Thus, there is space for the innovative work of Sobalin Chim Shapiro. He said, quote, it's like having two legs, a left leg and a right leg. You have to preserve in order to develop, and you have to develop in order to preserve. So that was actually the first time I heard that phrase. As a graduate student at the Royal University of Fine Arts, or RUFA, Sobalin Chim Shapiro is not a graduate student, sorry. She is a graduate of the RUFA. She is one of the pioneering artists slowly transforming classical dance to adapt to changing times and to make it more accessible to a wider audience. Her first major choreography, Samre Tichak, or Othello, is actually featured in Cambodia's 2020 project report to UNESCO as an example of the future of the art form. Othello inspired Sobalin because she related to Desmunda, who is in an interracial marriage and who left home to live with her husband. She also choreographed Pamina Devi, Cambodian magic flute, which tells the story of a young woman's struggle to find the strength to forge her own path, and Seasons of Migration, which deals with the stages that people go through as they grow accustomed to new living situations. She founded Khmer Art Ensemble in 2007, which is now transitioned into the Sobalin Arts Ensemble. In a 2011 interview, Sobalin explained that she has 3 choreographic styles. The first looks similar to traditional classical dance. It uses the traditional costumes, but features some new approaches, both choreographic and thematic. This style would include some of the dances discussed above. And the second is quite different. She said, quote, transforming both gesture and costume to create an entirely new genre. And the third, quote, uses a contemporary look to push the envelope. By incorporating new instruments and melodies and experimenting with movement and emotion in new ways. I was fortunate to be conducting research with Sobalin's company while she was involved in Tan's Connection, a project sponsored by the Goethe Institute between 2010 and 2013. This project brought 3 Southeast Asian contemporary choreographers, and this is actually next to me is the poster from that event. It says 1 story, 3 dances. It brought 3 Southeast Asian contemporary choreographers together for a cross-cultural exchange. During the part of the exchange that took place in 2011, the 3 choreographers had each developed some material using the same theme, the trial by fire episode of the Ramayana epic. It is important, since it's important in each of their cultures and equally troubled them in light of gender inequalities in their countries, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So just briefly, the trial by fire section of the Ramayana epic takes place after Sita in the Rimke, or Sita, is rescued from Ravana, and she returns with Rama, but is then her fidelity is challenged. So she has to undergo a trial by fire to prove that she was faithful to Rama during their time apart. So since the meeting in 2011, the artists each developed a 20-minute reinterpretation of the story and toured the pieces as a concert in Cambodia, Thailand, and Indonesia called Fire, 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 and that happened in 2013. In her piece, Stained, Sopaline was most concerned with understanding the impacts of the abduction and war through the perspective of Nying Seda, or Sita. She felt that the Rimke is really Seda's story, and that while Seda is trying to be heard throughout the epic, no one listens to her. Sopaline also used neoclassical movements, expanding classical dance gestures just slightly, beyond the norm. Her dancers undulate their chest more, they twist their arms into positions reminiscent of classical dance gestures, but that some of which are never actually seen in the classical dances to better portray this pain and suffering that the characters are going through. And I actually, I'm going to share a short excerpt from the YouTube video that was posted by Sopaline Arts Ensemble, which is a sample of this dance, so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about.
Seda tulព្រះរាមថាសេដាពិតជាស្មោះនឹងទ្រង់ក៏ទ្រង់ពុំព្រះសន្តាប់យៈព្រះរាមយល់ដូចតែគ្នាគេទាំងពីរឲ្យតម្លៃសេដាតែលើរូបកាយដូចគ្នាគេទាំងពីរមិនគោរពពាក្យវាចារបស់សេដាដូចគ្នា
Okay, so that's just to give you a little bit of a taste of the choreography in that piece and what I mean when I talk about a neoclassical version. Sopaline was the only participant to actually change the story of the Rimke to highlight tensions in domestic relationships in Cambodia at the time. So in her version of the story, Seda actually was raped, and that becomes clear throughout the dance. So regardless of that fact, some non-Khmer participants in the workshop questioned whether or not this would be characterized as contemporary, an indication of the strength of the modernist perspective discussed earlier, which views things too closely tied to past traditions as lacking in originality. Sopaline later explained to me when we saw each other in August of 2012 that the real reason that people don't think the reason that people think there isn't originality in tradition is that, quote, they can't see what is original because they don't know enough about the tradition. By 2011, government artists had welcomed some of the small changes that Shapiro had implemented to themes and gestures of the dance practice. An innovation to the standard set, which you can actually see in those pictures, which allowed the dancers to create three-dimensional objects, is now, or was at the time, a common feature of dance performances of many troupes, for example. Other innovations, however, were discouraged. At the time, Trung Chiang felt concern. He said, "Ganlain kla kwat do bait," like there are places where she's going too quickly. He said classical dance is solid but soft, that boys cannot do it. So it was unclear in the particular interview whether he was referring to the fact that she allowed young men to train, or if he was referring to the work that Prumsadon Ok, her student, was already doing in the United States at the time. And Prumsadon Ok has relocated to Phnom Penh, relocated in 2015, and formed the first all-male dance company featuring gay performers. And like Sopaline, his company also maintains a classical repertoire and develops new work. By 2020, though, the views of the ministry and at least some of the dance masters were beginning to change. In an interview on January 28th, 2020, for example, Trung Chiang advocated for the need for evolution and modernization, stressing the possibility of the Khmericization of international influence, alluding to what he called the Khmericization of Indian arts in the past. He said that I might wonder why his views on development changed from before. He then said that during the 1970s, there was so much culture that was lost that even 8-10 years ago, the focus had to be on preserving what was left. By 2020, he felt that it was possible to move on from preservation. His views on male participation in classical dance had also changed somewhat. He pointed to the incorporation of men performing the monkey role in the 1940s and said that while he would not call Prumsadon Ok's work Robamboran, he didn't think it was a problem for men to, quote, take the gestures from Robamboran, or classical dance, and create a new form. This shift in discourse was seen throughout the ministry, and has also made an impact on the artists. For example, But Chana, the current director of the Department of Performing Arts, noted that since many of the performing arts are currently recognized by UNESCO, it's now possible to focus on development. He explained that while the, quote, named dances can't be changed, new dances within the traditional genres could be created. Along these lines, several artists and teachers I spoke with in Phnom Penh highlighted similar views. Teacher Maing Kosma, for example, explained that while she still has concerns about the transmission of heritage, since there is less practice than before, she feels that the development of new creations that express current ideas about the world using classical gestures can be an important element of preservation because they can bring renewed interest to the form. She did include a word of caution, quote, don't change things that are already good. Similarly, artist Paul Chormelin explained that while we need to have preservation because classical dance is an old dance, but we need to accept technology to improve the form and make it more attractive and interesting. She highlighted several new contemporary and folk dances that have been created in recent years as an example. She did have some reservations about how change in dance should happen. Speaking about the use of classical gestures in contemporary dance, she said, quote, I know that they want to use the old ways to make a new way. If you make it better, it can be accepted. If you turn gold and diamonds into silver, it's not good. If you turn silver and gold into diamonds, it's okay. So there are many examples of the trend toward innovation and development. During my time in Phnom Penh, in 2019 to 2020 with both government organized productions and privately organized events. And these included the creation of new folk dances, the creation of new dances that used classical dance gestures, the creation of mixed theater pieces, new performances developed for tourists, and the use of traditional performing arts for contemporary Khmer dance, which is now a performing arts genre that is officially recognized by the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, in contrast to my previous fieldwork experience. And I'm happy to discuss further examples in the Q&A period. So at this time, I do have some examples prepared to share with you, but I see where we are in time. So I just wanted to take a pause and see if there were any questions. And I will keep going with some examples, but again, if you do have questions, I'm happy to pause and take those questions as they come in. So the one example that I wanted to bring up first is from the image that was actually used on the poster for this webinar. And this is from a short contemporary dance that was choreographed by folk dancer Chamran Sopia for the banquet of a steel and pipe company. The company specifically had wanted a contemporary dance to be created for the event to demonstrate Cambodia's continuing development. But as you can see from the image, much of the choreographic material borrows from classical dance gestures. The trend toward innovation actually made its way into my field notes almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of arriving, I attended rehearsals for a tour to Vietnam at the Secondary School of Fine Arts. 3 of the dances quickly caught my attention. They all had been choreographed between my dissertation research period and my arrival, so they weren't completely new. The first was Ken Van T's new folk dance, Peacock Dance. As Van T explained, the dance tells the story of a hunter who uses his trained peacocks to seduce a hermit peacock. To me, the use of some of the deep lunges, chapeis, even a few what might be considered arabesques in ballet, right, they spoke of Van T's experience choreographing contemporary dance and studying outside of the country, although she does identify this as a classical dance. I do have a video of this as well, but it wasn't working very well before. So I think for now I'm going to skip it, and I can go back to it later if that is something people want to do during the Q&A. The second dance was a version of Sakava, which I have up here on this slide. This is a dance performed by classical dancers dressed for Apsara dance. They're performing simple classical gestures, as well as it also includes folk dancers dressed as butterflies who are moving as if in flight in the background. While classical gestures were used, the dance was identified as Mahari. And then third, lakhon khol dancers, classical dancers, and a shadow puppet performer together performed a version of the myth of the sea of churning milk. And so in the story, the giants and the gods are attempting to locate the elixir of life. The churning of the sea results in the creation of apsaras, and in the end, the classical dancers emerge and perform apsara dance. So in this case, different art forms, all recognized by UNESCO, were being stitched together to create new works. Most striking to me at this rehearsal event was the response of ministry officials in attendance. One official from the Ministry of Tourism praised the dances, particularly Peacock Dance. He said that dances like that were vital because while everyone knows that Cambodia is good at preserving the traditional arts, it's equally important to demonstrate that they are able to develop and innovate. The dancers were going to be performing at an ASEAN event, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the official noted that other ASEAN countries like Thailand and Indonesia have already been innovating their art forms. He did not want people from those countries seeing Cambodia as behind. So the singing competition from October 16th to 26th that I mentioned at the beginning of the paper also demonstrated ministry efforts to innovate within tradition. New dances were commissioned for both the opening and closing ceremony by choreographers, including the dance masters Sot Somali, Vut Chanmali, Nam Narim, and Chuvman Sodachivi Bell, otherwise known as Bell. And I was able to see some of the development of each of the pieces. Sot Somali's piece, called Robam Morodok Wapatoa, which means cultural transmission dance, I guess roughly translated, used classical dance costuming inspired by Angkor and classical gestures, but was set to Mahari music. The performance took place in front of a backdrop of Angkorian temples and bas-reliefs of dancers. And as the name implied, it aimed to demonstrate the transmission of cultural heritage from Angkor to the present. And so I do, and this is actually a video clip embedded in my PowerPoint. So hopefully that will work. Let me know if you can't hear the sound, please. So Sot Somali said that from her perspective, this was not a contemporary dance, but it wasn't a classical dance either. It was a new type of dance that uses classical dance gestures, but does not use pinpiat music or the traditional orchestra. She said this makes it, quote, far, really far from classical dance, but not contemporary, end quote. She said that contemporary dance is not Khmer. Some other artists didn't agree. During a rehearsal for that piece, one dancer described the dances as really beautiful, but said she would characterize them as contemporary Khmer dance. And this was also true of Vut Chanmali's dance, which did push the movement slightly further, including some ballet-inspired movements. So a very brief section of that as well. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of what these two pieces look like and how they kind of bring out different innovative elements into classical dance, the use of classical dance gesture. So I just wanted to conclude with a few final thoughts here. The proliferation and creation of new work in multiple dance genres, with the encouragement of the Ministry of Culture, of course, within certain constraints, in recent years indicates that, at least in dance, national discourses surrounding artistic innovation are beginning to shift. In the early 2000s and even 2010s, national discourses emerged from the authorized heritage discourses that favored European romantic views of cultural purity and the preservation of heritage forms. These are being replaced, at least to some extent, by broader views of creativity that encourage innovation and experimentation within tradition as a way to transform culture and adapt to new environments. A point that was also made in Amanda Rogers' recent report about creative expression in contemporary arts making among young Cambodians. Here I argue that this is not the case just for contemporary arts in Cambodia, but for traditional arts as well. There's a sense that innovation is imperative for the perpetuation of Cambodia's artistic traditions. And while pressure remains to preserve dances of the past for future generations, there's now a space to move forward and innovate as well. As demonstrated by Nekrutira's words, there remains a concern that future generations may not have a strong awareness of the performance pieces of the past. There's a recognition that one way to ensure these traditions are not lost is to encourage creativity and innovation within the traditional arts so that they can continue to draw interest. And in this way, heritage both limits and inspires new cultural production. So again, thank you very much for your time. And sorry, I went a bit over the scheduled timing. And I'm happy to take any questions that any of you have. And of course, if you do want to contact me to find out more about my work or comment or ask additional questions, please feel free to email me as well.
Thank you, Celia. It was particularly interesting. Thank you for this very compelling presentation. And so the question of innovation within tradition and in the performing arts is very crucial to the expression and viability of dance and musical cultural heritage in Cambodia, as you were presenting. And you offered a very clear outline of the complex situation in which artists currently works. So thank you for that. This was like a lot of new material and new vision on how to consider cultural heritage today. The vision of artists, the vision of the government, and the vision of outsiders. So we have we have questions in the Q&A. I have a very short one to start with as a moderator. I have the privilege to ask my question first. So I would like to make a quick remark on the example that you mentioned, because it looks like there is often a divide between traditional in what you call this Eurocentric romanticized view as what like the traditional purity of Cambodian dance, and on the other side, innovation and contemporary dance, even though innovative creation are based on traditional choreographic and traditional gestures and traditional materials in general. So then you have cultural heritage that appears as another way to look at performance. And this other way to see performance doesn't necessarily reflect this divide between what is considered like the quote unquote traditional dance and the quote unquote innovative dance. So I guess my question is like, how far today can an artist depart from what is considered traditional dance in the purest sense, Eurocentric view of it, and still being considered as expressing Cambodian cultural heritage?
Oh, wow. You said it was a small question. What's happening? Just kidding. So that is a really great question. And I actually did have to cut a small little piece out of my presentation that maybe you noticed, where I talked about how for that singing competition, there was one dance that during rehearsals, the ministry decided had gone too far and was not Khmer enough for what they were looking for, at least for that particular event. And so they did, that choreographer did recreate the dance and incorporated a lot more classical gestures into the performance. So there certainly are, as I was talking about, these limits, but as of right now, those limits are pretty undefined. They're very unclear. And a lot of it really depends from what you're asking about in terms of how far can people really push. A lot of that really depends on the specific context in which the performance is happening, in which the choreography is happening. So what I mentioned that I had cut out of the presentation was that particular choreographer felt that it wasn't a problem for her to make changes that were asked by the ministry because it was a piece specifically requisitioned by those officials, and that in fact when they are creating their own work outside of kind of the government cultural production, they don't have the same kinds of limitations. So when creating work for private events, when doing their own choreography, working with various, many of the NGOs like Cambodian Living Arts that are active in Cambodia, there's certainly much more flexibility in terms of those limitations, but there is still some self-censorship. People, most of the artists do want to, use work that is inspired through different kinds of Khmer traditional performing arts, as opposed to moving more towards like what might be considered a Western contemporary dance performance practice. I don't know if I answered your entire question, but.
No, but you did. And I think that's very an importance of the contextual situation in which a performance may be considered as an expression of cultural heritage in one context, but not in another context. And so there is like this fluidity that makes that the audience also participate to the formation of, like to the recognition of cultural heritage, or at least to the recognition of a performance as promoting cultural heritage or not.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really stood out to me about the teacher Noptida's comments also, that she is all for development and innovation in the arts. She's happy to see it, but she is worried that in 10 or 20 years that people might look at the art that's been created now and think that that is the original form. So you still do see this kind of nervousness and desire for this original or pure form that really, from a realistic standpoint, doesn't necessarily exist, right? Because there is all this recognition that there had been a lot of change throughout time.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. I would like to now ask, there is a question by Saori Agai, and I was wondering if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Oh, hi, do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance to ask to you directly. I have read your paper, so it's sort of very thrilled to ask a question directly to you. Again, my name is Saori. I'm from Kyoto, Japan. So I have been kind of following Dong Auk's creations lately. So my question goes to the Burundian's view towards this gay, company, and does he see Burundian Auk's creations are more like innovation, transformation, or rather transgression? That's from me. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I'm happy to be able to address that in more detail. Prumsadon Oak's company is something that came up pretty frequently in conversations around preservation development, just like Sopali and Chim Shapiro came up frequently in those conversations as well. I think that the answer in terms of Prung Chiang's perspective is perhaps one of some ambivalence, right? So he is accepting of their use of the classical dance genre to do something new. So the newer choreographies that they develop, those are something that he would embrace. He does see them as having very strong technique. He's happy to see more people interested in classical dance, happy that they see it as beautiful. He recognizes the ability of Prum's company and Prum's dancers and their technical ability, but he would not, so as I said, like in the presentation, right, Prung's dancers also have a traditional repertoire, and that is something that Prung Chiang would not acknowledge in the same way, right? So it's not that he would necessarily be bothered that they are dancing classical dances, but he would not consider them to be classical dances because of the fact that they're all men. Even though he, as I said, he's recognizing that in the past, women performed all the roles, including the monkey role, and now men perform the monkey role. So he's always looking at, when I talk to him, he's always looking into history, into the past, at previous innovations as kind of a grounding for new ones. So he is seeing that, and so in some ways he is coming to terms with it, but he was very adamant that it would not, from his perspective, be considered to be Robamboran, but rather something new that uses those classical dance gestures.
So we have another question from Kunsreinak. And so this is a more personal question, actually, that is wondering why you went to study Khmer dance.
Oh, well, thank you for that question, Sreniak. And don't worry, I can see your question too, and don't worry about your language. I apologize if my pronunciation in Khmer was incorrect throughout my entire presentation. So it's actually kind of an interesting story. I did ballet growing up, and then for my undergraduate degree, I went and studied modern dance, contemporary dance. And one of the classes that we had to take was a dance appreciation class that was called Seeing Dance. And our teacher was able to invite dancers from all different places to come and speak to us and do workshops and demonstrations. And one of those dancers was someone who was a refugee who had come from Cambodia, and he was living in California, and he flew out to talk to us about his experience of learning dance in Cambodia, having to flee the country, and then continuing to practice as he came to the United States. And he also did a little workshop with monkey roll, which I did terribly at. But that was how I first got interested in Cambodia, but it was in Cambodian dance. But it was something that it stuck with me, but I did a whole bunch of other things. And then later on, when I went to graduate school, I came back to it and decided that it was something I really wanted to pursue for the long term.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I was just looking at the chat. And so I see that Jean-Baptiste, you have a question, and I was wondering maybe you could unmute yourself and ask your question directly. Otherwise, if you cannot, I can actually read it. So, okay, so Jean-Baptiste said that he didn't hear that Prung Chiang got conservative positions towards gay performers. And he asked, was it implied or was it a personal interpretation?
That's a great question. Thanks, JB. I also don't think that he has conservative positions towards the gay performers. I think he has maybe somewhat conservative positions about what is considered true, pure Robamboran. So when I was talking to him, particularly in this most recent visit, right? Whenever we talked about issues of preservation, whenever we talked about gender in classical dance or sexuality in terms of classical dance, I didn't get a sense that he was taking a conservative position. It was more a sense like I was talking about throughout the presentation of really thinking through what are the boundaries and distinctions between different dance forms that seem to be rather undefined right now from the ministry perspective. And so I think that as a representative from the ministry, I think some of that was coming through in things that he was saying. So it wasn't a comment on gay dancers. It wasn't or gayness at all. It was more a specific comment to the fact that a man would perform the classical dance female role or the classical dance male role, rather than having it being any position that was specific to being any position specific to sexuality. Or tolerance for sexuality. I don't know if that answers your question fully. If not, please send a follow-up. Okay, great. I can see you in the chat.
All right, does anyone have another question for Celia? And again, if you don't think of a question, or if you feel a little shy to ask right now, remember that the presentation will be available online, and that you can see on the PowerPoint the email address of Celia, and you can contact her and ask a question and follow up afterwards.
And if you want, I can try to show you a little bit of the Peacock Dance if you haven't seen it. Well, if you're thinking of potentially questions. But it wasn't working very well before, just as a warning.
Yeah, we can watch like more. I would be interested in 1 second of the Peacock Dance.
All right, let's see if it'll work for you guys. Whoa. All right. Try to. All right, it broke apart a little bit at the end, but I think hopefully you got some idea.
It did actually. That's very interesting. I really had never seen this dance. So there is another question from Tiratun. And so it says, Khmer classical dance has evolved over time. What the standards do we use to judge whether a dancing style is Khmer or not?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think that really is the question that all of these artists and these government officials are trying to grapple with. So, you know, we talk about, I briefly mentioned how classical dance has evolved over time, and how there are actually specific periods that people speak about as being moments of like quick moments of evolution, speedy moments of evolution or change, through the taking inspiration from the Angkorian temple specifically, taking inspiration from, you know, even Prung Chiang mentions that taking inspiration from India in terms of story and movement and style in some regards, right? He actually used the term Khmericization in our interview to describe that kind of process. So certainly there is this recognition that classical dance has been continually evolving and changing, but you know, because of this sense of a desire for purity, for an original classical dance, that comes from, in a lot of ways, European discourses, and then also because of the history with the Khmer Rouge, you see a kind of, especially right after the Khmer Rouge, as the dancers were returning to Phnom Penh, or some dancers working in refugee camps and moving to the United States and other parts of the world, you still see this desire to look to what happened before, anything that happened really before the Khmer Rouge, as the root of what is Khmer, or what is traditionally Khmer, whether or not it had influence from other places in the world, right? So just like with thinking about rock music, the rock music that developed in the 1960s has also become part of that traditional Khmer heritage of music, whereas things like K-pop and rap are things that are a cause of concern for some people in the ministry because they're seen as introducing foreign elements into the traditional arts. So I think that's a really great question. And I'm sorry that I don't have a solid answer for it, because I don't think that anybody has a specific or solid answer for what delineates certain elements of classical dance as the original standard. But I would say that generally speaking, there is a sense that they are using that time period of the independence period between 1953 and 1970 as kind of that standard of what classical dance should be like. And the reason that I say that is for two reasons. One, I had an experience, there is a dance troupe, a classical dance troupe in Bante Srai area, and they came and toured in the US in 2012, I think, or 2013. And so when they were in New York, we went to the Natural History Museum here, and someone had dug up a video of classical dancers from like the 1920s dancing at the temples as, you know, part of a colonial event, right? And the dancers from that group immediately, they were kids, right? So 14, 15, even younger, some of them, they started laughing because they were saying, that's not right. That's not what classical dance is supposed to look like. They're doing all the gestures wrong. And so the troupe leader had to stop and let them know that in the past, that is how classical dance was performed. For that reason, and then also because there was a recent research project at the Department of Performing Arts where they were looking at the kabak bat and how it had changed through different generations. And the idea was that they would look to try to figure out which form of the kabak bat was the most accurate, or which form was the best. So I actually didn't get to see the end result of that because it was happening as I had to leave Cambodia at that time. But I would be interested to know, I think that might provide some answer of what the artists currently are thinking of as kind of the standard or pure form of classical dance today. Sorry if that rambled on a little bit.
Well, thank you. That was actually very, very clear. And I particularly like the example that you take about pop and rock music from the 60s that are considered a part of like the cultural heritage nowadays, while music created today are not in our cause of concern. So that's actually it is a very fascinating and sensitive topic as well. So there is a question by Jean-Baptiste Pousse. He has another question, so I'm going to read it too. He's asking, what is your personal view of innovation from classical trained dancers? And the second part of the question is, do you think in the future there will be more vertical works that don't use any classical elements at all?
Wow. Thank you for that question, Jean-Baptiste. I just want to clarify, maybe you can if in the chat, if I'm interpreting your question wrong, just let me know because I can see what's happening in the chat too. So are you asking in the first question, what do I think of the work that they are creating? Or are you asking what do I think they think about innovation? I don't know if that's clear. I think it's the first one. Oh, how do I think it will evolve? Thank you. Again, I'm not entirely sure. What I think is going to happen is I think that at least in terms of kind of the national cultural production, right? So I'm thinking of national cultural production side as separate from like the artist's personal work, those artists who are doing work on their own outside of the government work, since as I think you know, Jean-Baptiste, a lot of the dancers in Phnom Penh do work for the government and often also create their own works individually of the government. So from the government side, I think you will get two different things, right? I think in the government side, you will start to see a strict, they'll start to figure out where those boundaries are between what they consider to be traditional arts and contemporary arts, and also in terms of the specific forms or genres. So like what Chana was talking about in our interview, he was saying that, you can have innovation within the traditional art forms now because they've been recognized, because they've done a lot of preservation work already, and 90+% of the dances have been reconstructed, at least that's what they say. And so because of that, you can have new creation of actually new dances. And I do see a trend towards the creation of new classical dances by artists, as opposed to, and this was something that was mentioned by one of the artists specifically, but you're starting to see work created by and credited to specific classical dancers who are doing the choreography, as opposed to work being created by someone in the royal family. So I do think that there is going to be more of a trend towards that. I interviewed Prince Tesso Sisawat, who has kind of taken over the reins as director of the Royal Ballet, and he talked about a lot of the talent in the current generation of classical dancers, like Ketia, like Nali, like Vut Chanmali, who I mentioned in the paper, and how their creativity could be used to create new dances. But that said, I do think that there's still going to be this distinction between what is classical dance and then what is maybe a neoclassical form, or a form of dance that's not classical because it doesn't use the Pinpiat orchestra, or it doesn't use some of those important elements of what classical dance from their perspective has to have. Whereas I think outside of the government, you're going to see perhaps similar kinds of innovation, but maybe more allowance for different styles and different elements to become part of classical dance. And perhaps over time, that will then continue to influence government, and government policies and ideas about it will continue to change as well. You know, that was kind of a long answer. And then your second question, do I think there will be more radical work that doesn't include any classical elements at all? This depends on what kind of form of dance you're talking about. I think in terms of contemporary dance, I think you can already see that. And there's that, oh gosh, and now I can't remember the name of the group in Siem Reap. That it's just two dancers now, but they are specifically, they're, doing their own work. They are not, they're not really a part of a lot of the government competitions on contemporary dance and things like that. And it's because, thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Yes, the new Cambodian artist. And they're specifically not involved in a lot of those government activities because they don't want the ministry to have any say over the kind of work that they produce. So I do think that there is a space for that in contemporary dance, certainly. Yeah, going into the future.
Thank you, Celia. Thank you again for this very interesting presentation, and it sparked a very interesting conversation afterward. I think we arrived at the end of our time. So if you want to say a conclusive word before we hand the webinar to Sandy.
Well, I just wanted to mention, I know that I think somebody posted that there was a message on Facebook, and I think people have found out today that Nekru MTA passed away a few days ago. So I just wanted to, you know, give my condolences to everyone. And I did get to meet MTA a few times last year, and it was a very meaningful experience, and my thoughts go out to her family and of course all of the artistic community in Cambodia.
Thank you, Sandy. We're gonna let you conclude.
Okay. Thank you so much, and to Celia and also Stephanie for joining us today. And I know that you stay up very late right now because it's already 11:30 in the US. And thank you so much for all the attendees who also joining us from the US. Stay up late together and having a lot of interesting questions that allow our speaker to dive in deeper into her presentation as well. And last but not least, I'm also thanks to my teams who stay behind helping with all the communication and technical preparation for this webinar to run really smoothly for today. And at the end, I'm so thankful again for those who still stay tuned with CKS, and also for the coming webinar. You may expect to see the coming webinar on 21st and also 26th June, again on CKS Zoom and also Facebook Live. So if you are interested to stay tuned with us more with the update information, please do not forget to subscribe on our site. Also follow us on Facebook page so that you can get all the instant information and update from the CKS. So at the end, I'm pleased again, and thank you so much for those who joining us and stay with us until the end of the webinar. And thank you especially to our speaker and moderator for really insightful presentation and very interactive discussion for today. And thank you so much, and stay safe and healthy together during this outbreak of COVID-19. Thank you, really.